Thank you everyone for introducing yourself in the chat. So great to see so many people here and representing such a wide variety of roles and fields. So this is really exciting. Before we shift into any content, one thing that we like to do at Trauma Smart is always just take an intentional moment to arrive in our space, to show up together, to shift our energies, to connect, and just basically have a little bit of fun before we jump into any topics. So we're going to do this icebreaker connection activity kind of via the chat, recognizing that it would be hard to do this in a virtual space with everybody unmuting and sharing out. So we kind of do our connections with some virtual adaptations, but we're going to try it out anyway. So we're going to do what I like to call a chat waterfall. And what you're going to do is I'm going to give you a prompt, and you are going to type your response to that prompt into the chat, but do not hit send until I say go, because the idea is that we're going to waterfall our responses all at once. So to be clear, I will give you a prompt, get it ready, type it in the chat, but don't hit send until you hear me say go. Okay, we're going to start off nice and easy. In the chat, type, what is your current beverage? Because I'm pretty sure everyone has likely got a beverage sitting on their desk or near them. If you have no beverage, type no beverage or no drink. Type it in the chat. Everybody put it in there. And remember, don't hit send. Okay, everybody got it? 3, 2, 1, go. No drink, Dr. Pepper, water. A lot of Dr. Pepper people here. Water, water, coffee. You're my people. You're my people. Coke. No drink. Bold choice. Bold choice. Gotta hydrate. Caffeine ice. Yes, I love those. Seeing a lot of commonality in here. There's lots of Dr. Pepper people. That's fun. My kids are Dr. Pepper people. We recently discovered zero sugar coconut Dr. Pepper. I highly recommend. So if you like a dirty Dr. Pepper, it's kind of along those lines. So, all right, next round, get your fingers ready, type in the chat. What is a movie that you can quote without even thinking that hard about it? So again, type your response, don't hit send until you hear me say go. What is a movie that you can quote without thinking about it? Okay, 3, 2, 1, go. Oh, some good movies in here. The Princess Bride. Oh, my heart. I love that one. My cousin Vinny. Utes. I love it. Suicide Squad. Mean Girls. I got A Few Good Men. Christmas Vacation. Ferris Bueller's Day Out. A League of Their Own. There's no crying in baseball. There's some great movies here. So you guys just made my watch list for this weekend. Thank you. Mine is The Sandlot. Like, that's one that gets quoted a lot around my house, mostly to my kids. You're killing me, Smalls. All right, last round, everybody. Last round. You just won the lottery. What's your first splurge? What is that thing that what's the first little guilty pleasure you're splurging on? You just won the lottery. What's going to be your first splurge? Get it ready. Don't put it in yet. 3, 2, 1, go. Lots of houses, vacations, lipo. Feel that? Yep. House, cars, projects. A lot of commonalities here. So if you didn't get a chance, I highly encourage you to scroll through the chat. I always think it's fun to see in a room full of complete strangers how much in common that we have, how connected we really are. Y for yes, N for no in the chat. Did anybody feel their energy shift a little bit in participating in that? Y for yes, N for no in the chat. Yeah, a little bit. Just a little fun way to arrive in our space, recognizing that if we're going to be talking about brain states that we really believe we have to walk the walk and talk the talk, and recognizing that oftentimes showing up even in these virtual learning spaces that we need a moment. You all likely are rushing from different tasks throughout your day. Maybe you are physically rushing from building to building, place to place. And so we use this opportunity to increase our connectedness. Even in this short time, this short space, build our relationships, leaning into what we know about how relationships support us in moving through brain states. So now that I've learned a little bit more about all of you, I'll take a moment to introduce myself. As it was stated in our very nice introduction, thank you, Renee. My name is Jeannie Thurston, and I am a licensed professional counselor and certified clinical trauma professional with more than 2 decades working in the mental health field. For the past 14 of those years, I have been specifically working with the Trauma Smart program. And for those of you who may not be that familiar with Trauma Smart, we always like to say we're like the best kept secret in the Kansas City area. We are a research-based community prevention program that was developed by Crittenton Children's Center. We are part of the St. Luke's Health System, St. Luke's Hospital of Kansas City, which is a part of the larger BJC health system. For the past 18 years, we have been working in education organizations, healthcare organizations, nonprofit organizations, all across the nation, supporting them in implementing and sustaining trauma-informed care. We really take a whole systems approach, and we have a really comprehensive approach in the ways that we work with organizations so that they have long-term success in being able to make those whole system shifts towards becoming trauma-informed. One of the key components that we have recognized over the year in equipping individuals in becoming, really understanding of what it takes to show up in places and spaces from that trauma-informed perspective is being able to understand what is happening in the brain, to be able to get curious about behavior, understand what is driving that behavior, using what we now know about how trauma impacts the brain development, brain states, and using that information to better support how we show up, how we respond versus react when behavior becomes challenging. And so that is going to be the focus of what we talk about today. I will warn you that this is a big topic, and we're really kind of doing a high-level overview here today. My hope is that it will spark a curiosity in you to continue to learn more, but that we'll provide you with some foundational information. We'll share with you a way that we approach providing this information and education to sites and individuals that we work with in a way that we hope supports you all in being able to carry it forward. So one of the things that I think is foundational to start with when we're going to be talking about brain states is really just kind of starting with establishing some brain basics. So at the most fundamental level, we know that the brain develops in really predictable sequence. We know that it develops from the bottom up and inside out, meaning that the parts of our brain that are responsible for survival and emotion are the ones that develop for us first. So that when we experience stress, those are the ones that our brain can access most quickly, making the parts of our brain dedicated to thinking, reasoning, and learning a little harder for us to get to. It's important when we are thinking about brain and brain states and behavior that we keep in mind at all times that the brain's number one job is to keep us alive. It is uniquely designed to prioritize survival above all things. And so our brain is designed to constantly be very aware of patterns in our environment and in our experiences and in our relationships that might indicate the potential for our survival to be threatened. With that in mind, then we can recognize that we now know that brain states, where we show up in the different parts of our brain, reflect in our behavior. And so we can now recognize that behavior is often going to be a reflection of which part of the brain that individual is operating from in that moment. When we have that understanding, we can show up in ways that feel more effective, feel safer and more authentic, and support that individual in being able to develop out their own skills to support resilience and regulation. And again, before we go too much further, I want to just acknowledge that the brain is incredibly complex. What we're going to be talking about is not going to be like that super deep dive into neuroscience. I'm not a neuroscientist. That is not my background or expertise. What instead we're going to be talking about is really understanding kind of a practical framework that simplifies what happens in the brain. So again, that we can understand it and be better equipped to respond more effectively to behaviors in real time. So for our purposes, we are going to really just kind of simplify it down and talk about some very basic parts of the brain. And then we'll use those parts of the brain to introduce the tool that we use to help individuals understand brain states more fluidly. So for our purposes, we're going to be talking about the brain stem. So the part of our brain that, again, develops first, that is responsible for our physical and survival responses. We're going to be talking about the limbic system, which is that kind of midbrain region that especially of importance for our purposes that houses the amygdala and the hippocampus. So this part of the brain is what is involved for all things related to emotion and memory. And then lastly, we're going to be talking about the prefrontal cortex, that last part of our brain to develop. This part of our brain is what supports thinking, reasoning, problem solving, learning, executive functions. So keeping those kind of basic parts of the brain in mind, that's what I want you to hold on to as we kind of move into introducing what we call our brain as a car analogy. So we developed out this brain as a car analogy because we wanted to find a way to help individuals create a common language to talk about this neuroscience, to have a way that felt more easily understood and accessible for the average person, whether you had mental health training or not, that this was a tool that we could use to help people understand what is happening in the brain more fluidly. So with this tool, we recognize those three primary parts of the brain, and we correlate them to the three primary parts of the car. So we have our brainstem, and that correlates to the trunk of the car. We have that limbic system, including the amygdala and the hippocampus, which corresponds to the back seat of our car. And then we have that prefrontal lobe, prefrontal cortex, which corresponds to the front seat of our car. So again, this gives us a way to more quickly identify where someone may be operating from in a way that doesn't require us to be able to remember the scientific terms in the moment. And it gives us a way, especially when we have individuals who we work with who also understand this analogy, it gives us a way to communicate more fluidly with one another. I often will joke with people, I don't walk around saying, "Oh, I'm all up in my limbic today," when I'm having big feelings. And so it just provides a more accessible way for us to help people recognize where someone else may be functioning from, where they themselves may be functioning from. So let's get into what each part of the car represents from brain states and how we can begin to recognize when someone may be operating from that part of their brain. Starting out, let's talk about the trunk. The trunk, again, corresponds to that brain stem. We call this our physical state because everything that has to do with our autonomic physical responses happens in this part of our brain. So think about things that you do without having to give it conscious thought that are tied to your capacity for survival. Think about things like breathing, respiration rate, heartbeat, heart rate, digestion. All of that are our autonomic responses tied to our survival that we don't have to give conscious thought to. Also from this part of our brain is our actual survival responses. So think fight, flight, freeze, fawn. And we'll talk more about recognizing those in just a moment. And so this part of our brain, again, our survival responses are happening automatically. These are reactive behaviors, not responsive behaviors, meaning we don't give conscious thought to these behaviors showing up. It is our brain prioritizing survival in that moment. So it will use the behavior that feels most effective for ensuring survival in that moment. And again, it is recognizing that those behaviors won't necessarily make sense to us because it is that person's perception of threat, that person's perception of danger. And we may not even perceive it as a real threat, but to that person's brain, that threat is real. Another key thing to remember about someone in their brainstem, in their trunk, in that physical state, is that when this part of our brain is activated, the other parts of our brain are deactivated, or our capacity to access them is significantly diminished. So then the skills that we would normally have, under regulated circumstances, our ability to process language, our ability to think through a problem, to problem solve, make decisions, all of those things when the brainstem is activated is inaccessible. And what I tend to see happen is that when we don't recognize this, we tend to talk a lot at people. What's wrong? What can I do to help? Or we're giving them like, sit down, go over to your calming area. What do you think you should do differently? And sometimes that has that capacity then to continue to escalate the situation versus de-escalating the situation. So some things to keep in mind that when someone is operating from their brainstem, from their trunk, again, it is remembering that these are reactive, not responsive behavior. So oftentimes, we might default to judgment. We might default into some biases and think that this person is choosing to behave badly. But it's important, again, that we keep in mind that this behavior is the brain prioritizing survival. So when we recognize it as an adaptive function that is there to protect that individual from their brain's perspective, it predisposes us then to kind of lean back into our compassionate curiosity and really start to kind of get curious about what is that behavior telling me. So when we are trying to recognize if someone is operating from their trunk, we are looking for reactions, we are looking for behaviors that show us that person's brain is trying to prioritize survival. And again, the threat doesn't have to make sense to us. It doesn't even have to really be visible to us. It's just that recognition that person's brain is perceiving whatever is happening internally, externally as that potential threat. And so, as I mentioned, we are looking for those survival responses. So thinking again, fight responses. So are they using behavior to act out of that perceived danger and their body is shifting really quickly into rapid mobilization? So that might look like the things that we typically see around aggression, property destruction, having meltdowns with little regard for their own safety or others. So one of the distinctions that like when I have talked about this, particularly with individuals who are working with children, is that kind of that distinction between a tantrum and a meltdown. Meltdowns tend to happen from the trunk, where tantrums tend to happen more in the backseat. Because in a meltdown, there isn't really that fight response doesn't really prioritize anything or around them, versus a tantrum might be more goal oriented. I need to get something, a tangible connection, or get away from something. And so when that need is met, that behavior tends to stop, versus in a meltdown, until that safety is felt, it doesn't matter if there is harm to self or others, there's not that awareness because the brainstem has taken over. In that flight response, you are seeing individuals using their behavior to move away from any potential danger, to escape that potential threat. So you think about, physically running away, hiding from others, probably in some of the more nuanced behaviors that we tend to see with like our adult clients, our older students, are things like not showing up, ghosting on appointments, not wanting to go to school, some of that school refusal. So that can be tied to those flight survival behaviors. That freeze response, so thinking about they are withdrawing to avoid that potential perceived threat, disconnecting, disassociating from those surroundings when it feels too overwhelming, too threatening. So oftentimes, that is an individual who, you are recognizing that they're not processing a lot of the information that is happening. That is things that processing information, making sense of things happens in that prefrontal cortex. But if they are in that freeze mode, they're in that brainstem. And so they're not taking in instruction. They're not remembering information. Always hear this kind of described as the lights are on, but nobody's home type of affect and behavior. That fawn response. So this one is kind of newer in discussions around understanding survival response. And you'll get some people who will debate that fawn is kind of a combination of both fight or flight, depending on how it shows up. I think that the important thing to remember about this fawn response is that this is someone trying to keep themselves safe by avoiding any potential conflict. And so this tends to show up a lot with those people-pleasing behaviors, with individuals who will try and change up their behaviors to meet the demands of whatever is happening in that relationship or that social setting, to be well aligned so that there isn't that threat of conflict or that perception of not being liked or somebody else's needs, being the front runner, so that there is no perception of conflict or potential danger. So now let's shift into the backseat. So again, this is that emotional state. And when we talk about the emotional state, we are talking about that limbic system. We are talking about emotions both comfortable and uncomfortable. So sometimes backseat we tend to only focus on the uncomfortable emotions because that's the one that has more of the more obvious challenging behaviors that we tend to see show up. But it's remembering that all emotion is kind of stored and lives in this part of our brain. It's important that we remember that, similar to when we are in our brainstem, in our trunk, that again, it's that diminished capacity to access those executive functions that live in that prefrontal cortex, in that front seat. That one thing I think is really important to keep in mind when we're thinking about individuals who are operating from this emotional state is, again, that our brain is constantly kind of scanning the environment, looking for patterns, looking for potential threats. That's really what the amygdala's job is in our brain. It is that pattern seeker. It's kind of like our alarm system, our watchdog of our brain, and it is there to kind of cue us in to patterns, to potential triggers that might alert our brain that a potential threat is imminent. And when it hits on it, then it's going to send that information down to our brainstem so that it can activate the trunk and shift us into survival. So what tends to happen is that people who are in their back seat, they tend to be kind of hyper vigilant. They tend to be really sensitive to nonverbal cues, and those can get skewed. They can be misinterpreted. And so we often talk a lot about that it is really important that we, as providers, as the individuals who are providing support to others, be incredibly self-aware. That is one of the key skills that we teach as part of that trauma-informed perspective, is that we have to be the ones that lead regulation in the space. And so we have to be very aware of what cues we're giving off. We can think that we are presenting very regulated, and yet someone can still misinterpret our pensive thinking face as a potential threat. And so being very aware of, what does my face do? What is my body language in this moment? How might that be impacting this individual? Especially if I am beginning to recognize that they may be showing up in front of me in their backseat. So a common question that comes up when beginning to understand this brain as a car tool, and understanding brain states is, how do we recognize when someone is operating from their backseat versus their trunk? And really just kind of recognizing that it can be really easy to miss the cues that help us decide if something is being driven by emotion or if it's being driven by that survival response. And I'm here to tell you that we're all going to get it wrong at times. That it's not a perfect practice, because there is a lot that goes into being able to accurately read a person's cues. You think about the importance of the relationship building process in increasing our ability to be accurate in reading cues. The more experience that we have with someone, the safer, more connected that relationship builds, we're going to increase in our accuracy in reading those cues. But just hear me say that. It's entirely possible that sometimes we're going to get it wrong, and there's going to be a lot of nuances in an individual's behaviors. But some of the core things that we are looking for that help us determine when someone is in their backseat versus in their trunk is really determining, what are those signs of emotional discomfort that I'm seeing? How am I beginning to recognize that emotion-driven reactivity that really kind of reflects either they have something emotionally heavy kind of happening internally, they've got some of that internal emotional intensity, that emotional recognition that we now recognize isn't tied to any specific survival threat. And so you can see how that would be a little bit confusing. And so I wanted to put it back to you all as a chat to really kind of think about and reflect for yourselves. If you had to kind of distinguish cues that would maybe be backseat versus trunk for something, say anger, what would you recognize as a cue for backseat? Something that recognized that sign of that angry emotion that is causing discomfort, potentially reactivity, but doesn't really reflect a true threat to their survival. What is your kind of understanding about what that might look like? Thinking of that anger emotion. What do you read as potential cues for someone showing up from that emotional place of anger, not that survival-based anger behavior? Feel free to drop it in the chat, or if somebody wants to come off mute and talk that out. Yeah, getting very quiet. Clenched fist, furrowed brows, absolutely. Changes in the eyes, changes in the breathing pattern. And in your opinion, what would shift that behavior then into the trunk? What would be some of those things that you would start to say that now has shifted over into like fight mode? What are your all's thoughts? So in the backseat, we recognized, from moving to verbalization or simply leaving. Vocalization, lashing out verbally, maybe even lashing out physically. So, and again, there's going to be a lot of nuances in that depending on the person that's in front of you and all of the different cues. But again, this kind of gives you an idea of how do I begin to tell something from the backseat versus the trunk. Yeah, some elopement might reflect like my anger, my frustration has reached the point where I got to get out of here. that would indicate then that they maybe have split into their trunk, right? So last part that I want to talk about, and then I want to move into talking about what do we do with that information now that we've recognized once they're in that part of their car. So in that front seat, we are talking about that prefrontal cortex. This is that last part of the brain to develop. And I always found it fascinating when I learned that this part of the brain starts to rapidly develop about that toddler preschool age range. So you think about the importance of our high quality early childhood education, things like our parents as teachers and the home visiting programs and our high quality early childhood education centers and how important those are to that prefrontal cortex development. But also recognizing when this part of the brain finally finishes developing. Does anybody know what research has been telling us about when this part of the brain, what age we are when it stops developing or significantly slows? 25 to 27? Yeah, pretty close. Yes, so they had originally said around 25, and now more current research is telling us it's upwards of early 30s. And so I found that to be really illuminating. And it also like gave me some grace for things. I'm like, hey, anything that I wasn't so super proud of prior to like 35-ish, it's cool because my brain wasn't done developing. So I get a pass, right? That's how that works. I think this is important. Like for me, it was very eye-opening, both as a professional and as a parent, because it tells me that people benefit from co-regulation a lot longer in the developmental process than oftentimes we recognize, or that we even provide. Oftentimes what I see from individuals, especially when I'm working in education settings, is that they see big bodies and they assume full grown brains, and that's just not the case. Children 100% need co-regulation because we know this part of their brain that is responsible for all of those executive functions like solving problems, making decisions, controlling impulses, regulating emotions, being able to collaborate and engage in learning. It isn't fully developed for kids, not even high school kids, not even college kids. And so it's recognizing that, well, one, all human beings benefit from co-regulation, but definitely human beings who have not yet fully developed this part of their brain definitely benefit from having safe, healthy, regulated co-regulators to help them access this part of their brain and learn the skills necessary to be able to do these skills when the situation calls for it. Another thing that I think is really important to highlight about the front seat is to acknowledge that this part of the brain is not devoid of emotion. So that is something that sometimes gets confused because we talk about that limbic system, that backseat being the emotional state, and it very much is. But that doesn't mean that as human beings, we don't have emotion when we are in our prefrontal cortex. The distinction here is in that regulate emotion, that we can have emotion in the front seat, but we have the capacity to regulate through that experience. That, again, it doesn't trigger that emotional intensity, nor does it trigger that survival response. And that is an important distinction so that, we can make sure that we are properly recognizing where someone is showing up at. So we're going to do a little bit of practice. I'm going to put some little sentence scenarios up, and I just want you to indicate in the chat if you think that this individual is in their back seat or in their trunk, back seat, or front seat. A client raises their voice, crosses their arm, and says, "This isn't helping," while refusing to engage any further. What do you think? Front seat, back seat, or trunk? See some trunk, mostly back seats. And again, This isn't a perfect kind of assessment. And so it's thinking about what are the cues that would indicate to me that they might be in just that emotional intensity versus are they in that survival place? You could make an argument that if they refuse to engage, that maybe they're in shutdown. You would need some more cues. You can definitely see emotional intensity. So recognizing that refusal behaviors don't necessarily mean that they're in shutdown. Sometimes it is just using their behavior to tell you the intensity of their emotion. But depending on some other cues, it very well could be that freeze mode or that shutdown. And so backseat, likely. Trunk, you could make a case for it. Okay, next scenario. A child hides under the table when it's time to transition and does not respond when their name is called. What do we think? Yeah, we're seeing that trunk response where we're likely, based on some of those cues, seeing that they have gone into that freeze mode, right? That flight freeze mode. Next one, a client takes a deep breath during a difficult conversation and asks for a moment to think before responding. What do we think? Front seat, back seat, trunk. Oh, you guys are good. This one usually trips people up. So this is a perfect example of recognizing we can have emotion and be in the front seat. It is that recognition that we are able to access skill to get into the thinking and the reasoning and the problem solving and the regulation capacity in those executive functions. You guys are really great at this already. Last one, a teen becomes tearful and says, I feel like nobody understands me, while continuing to engage in the conversation. What do you think? Front seat, back seat, trunk. Yeah, this is one of those ones that could be a little bit tricky. So some things, yes, Tracy, exactly. Like you could make an argument that it's front seat, depending on, again, you're going to be looking for some other cues. So again, this is about having a tool that helps us to be more responsive, but also to help drive our curiosity in trying to understand the cues that someone is giving us. So we could make an argument for backseat. You can make an argument for the front seat because they're staying in the conversation. We would want to look at, again, some of those other cues, or are they accessing skills to help themselves regulate that are helping them stay present? Or are they sitting kind of still in that emotion while they are still engaged in the conversation? Like they didn't get up and flee, run away, or shut down, but maybe they are still locked into that emotional intensity or emotional reactivity. So as I mentioned, once we have that capacity to identify where someone is operating from in that brain as a car, in those brain states, then we are better equipped to recognize, understand, and respond to the need that is behind the behavior. Um, and it and I think that having that as a tool for me honestly helps to kind of depersonalize what is happening, because we can get into a place where again we have brains that are predisposed to judgment. It's just what our brains like to do. And when we have this tool, it can help us kind of stop that natural tendency towards judgment, or where we tend to over personalize someone's behavior, and recognize that they're having a challenging moment, that this is something that is happening to them. It's not something that they are doing to me. That we can recognize, again, like I said, that their behavior is adaptive, that is their brain's best way that it knows how at this point in time to get their needs met. And so then we use that information then to help us identify what's the need, so that we can support that individual in getting their needs met, and hopefully beginning to build skill to get their needs met in a way that is healthier, more adaptive for their relationships in the environment. So we recognize that each one of the brain states, each part of our car has a specific need. When someone is in their trunk, when they're in the brainstem, I always kind of like remember it like this. If I locked you in the trunk of your car, what would you need? You'd want to get out. You'd want to get safe. So we remember that when someone is in their trunk, they need safety, physical and psychological safety. When someone is in their limbic system, in that backseat range, in that emotional state, what we need is connection. I will hear this frame sometimes as, oh, they're so attention seeking. That behavior is attention seeking. They just want attention. And when you reframe attention for what it truly is someone needing someone to attend to them, to connect with them. And so we recognize that the need in this part of our brain, in the back seat, is connection. So I always tell people, train your brain, reframe it. When you find yourself saying attention seeking, switch it up to connection seeking and see how that doesn't predispose you to being more open to exploring those needs. And then finally, in that front seat, in that prefrontal cortex, our brain needs meaning. We are constantly taking in thousands upon thousands of pieces of information every single second. And our brain is constantly trying to sort that information and make sense of all that is happening in our world. And so we recognize then that the need in this part of our brain, in that prefrontal cortex, would be meaning. So let's look at, how do we do that for individuals? And again, there's going to be a lot of nuance to this. There's going to be a lot of, that individual, the setting that you're in, their needs and things like that. But we're going to talk about some kind of universal truths in meeting those individual needs, so that we have some starting places. So first, thinking about safety. First and foremost, and at Trauma Center, we do entire lessons where we talk nothing of more than anything around just really understanding how it is we become very self-aware. Because again, I think about it like this. If I am in my trunk or my backseat, and this individual is in their trunk or backseat, who's driving? Who's driving the car? And if nobody's driving, what's going to happen in this interaction? Right? That car is going to crash. And that's not good. Our goal is to create that safety, to provide that space. We don't want to escalate the situation. So I 100% have to check in with myself first and think about, do I have the capacity to engage in this interaction? Especially if I am interacting with a client that I know might present some challenging behaviors. I have to really own what is my capacity for regulation. I want to make sure that I am using what I know about how brains work, and I'm using minimal, clear language. I'm not trying to talk this person into regulation, because that's just not how brains work. You can't talk someone into regulation. They can't access the part of the brain where language is processed. So we're keeping our language minimal and we're keeping it clear. We want to make sure that we are eliminating, reducing any immediate threats, and we are communicating that physical safety in our spaces. And one of the things we talk about a lot in our trauma-informed approach is really being proactive and preventative. And so to the best of our ability, we are really leaning into what we understand about how consistency, routines, predictability provide safety in our environments. When they know that they can count on us to show up consistently, congruently, that the space is going to be the same, what happens next is going to be the same, that communicates safety, that meets that need for safety for individuals. Before we can move on in interactions with anyone, we have to ensure that safety is being met. Once safety has been met, then we can move on to meeting the need in that backseat area for connection. Really thinking about, again, how are we regulating our presence? How are we ensuring that we are showing up in a space where we can listen and reflect, recognizing that we have to help people be able to name what they are feeling, and checking in with them using that curiosity, validating that emotional experience that we are witnessing, and making sure that as we respond to them, that we are offering support, not solutions. What tends to happen is that we kind of start to prioritize our own need for meaning, speed, efficiency. Sometimes we have a hard time and we don't like to sit in our discomfort with someone's behavior, so we're trying to rush them to problem solving, and we start offering solutions instead of being there with them, providing that felt safety through our connection. Once we have met those needs for safety and connection, then and only then can we support clients in being able to get their need for meaning. How we can do things to support meeting that need for meaning in our spaces is, again, to actively encourage skill building and planning, to have some ownership and some agency over identifying what that looks like. What do they need? What do they feel like they need? Not just what we think they need. Have voice and choice in how that happens. And this one is a big one, y'all, that we really intentionally normalize that common humanity that we all have. We all are going to have hard times. We all have struggles. If you show up as a human being in this planet and sometimes you feel like it's hard and you have a lot of big feelings about it, congratulations, you're a human. And really normalizing that it's okay to struggle. That is part of our common humanity, part of our existence in this world. So I wanted to provide an opportunity for us to go through a scenario, and we'll go through this together and kind of quickly, because I want to make sure and leave a little bit of time at the end to kind of wrap up. But we're going to walk through this scenario and then answer some of these questions. So a parent arrives for a meeting already appearing tense and immediately begins speaking loudly about frustrations with communication. As the conversation continues, their voice escalates and they interrupt frequently, saying, "No one is listening to me anyway." When you attempt to explain, the parent becomes more agitated and takes a defensive body posture. Despite this, they continue talking and they do not leave the interaction. So again, starting with, where do you feel like this situation, if you are that person engaging with the parent, where does it put you? Would you go into your back seat? And if so, how would you maintain your regulation or pull yourself forward in your front seat? Maybe you are really good at regulation in challenging situations. Maybe you're already regulated. So then think about, where is the parent? Where do you feel like the parent is? What are some of those cues that you are recognizing that they are in that trunk? You see cues that represent a survival response, or are they in the backseat? Are you recognizing cues that reflect that emotional intensity or reactivity? And then based on where you put them, and their brain is the car, what's that need that you can now recognize? And what are some ideas that you have about how you might respond, offering support, not solutions? And you can feel free to jot your thoughts in the chat if you'd like to share. You can come off mute if you would like to talk through how you are interpreting this scenario. And again, it's not about being perfect. It's about being curious and coming to recognize, how you are beginning to understand utilizing this specific tool.
I'll go off mute.
Thank
I
you.
think for me, I try not to match people's energy, but sometimes,
Mm,
as a human, you just do that.
yep. Yep.
Even if I came into that meeting regulated, I would probably go to my back seat just because
Mhm.
somebody else is bringing in their fight. And so I would, actively like in my brain trying to also listen to what they're saying, but um also knowing that my regulation is off right now because
Yeah.
their energy just shifted everything. I'd probably be saying I'm safe, it's fine. We can work this through. I just need to turn on my listening ears so that I can hear what the root of their frustration is so that I can help them get back from their trunk to their back seat to their front seat. So
Yes.
I guess I would go into problem solving mode
Mhm.
in within myself so that I could do what's best for them. And then I guess once I feel like I'm back to my front seat, I'd say I would be like, okay, well, let's just take a breather. I heard
Mhm.
you say that no one is listening, but I'm sitting here, I'm with you, and I want to have a resolution with this. So let's just like take a deep breath really quick because we're both really on high alert. So let's just breathe through this just really quick. Doesn't have to be, weird. We can just breathe. And let me tell you what I heard you say, and
Yeah.
then correct me if I'm wrong, and then let's move forward.
Yeah.
Um, and I mean, I've been in situations like this, and I
Mhm.
make them do the weird thing of taking a deep breath, and that really does like resettle the
Yeah.
room. And then once they are cueing to me that they've calmed down, then we'll go into problem solving. And then we can work through whatever the problem was. But really, if they're starting out from the trunk, we can't really, like you said, we can't have any resolution or any of that prefrontal cortex
Yeah.
problem solving be done. So you kind of have to help them move and
Yep.
yourself back to the front seat so that you can
Yeah.
leave that meeting feeling like, we both at least heard each other. So I think that's how I would
Yes.
approach it.
Yes, and I definitely heard you using things that really reflected meeting that need for connection in that backseat, which I think is great. And it's really recognizing that, like you said, we're not going to move into anything further until I have met that need for connection. That we have recognized that we need to shift and to focus on regulation before we can move into that problem solving space. And I love how you used your kind of in the moment regulation strategies of utilizing your own self talk. That is one of those great ways that we support our own regulated presence in those situations. So thank you so much, Sydney, for being the brave one to come off mute and talk that through. I'm going to skip over our second scenario because I want to touch on these kind of key takeaways just to kind of wrap up our conversation today. So some of the key things that I hope you're walking away with, in addition to our brain as a car tool, is really understanding that behavior reflects the brain state, where they are in their brain as a car, not defiance. Again, this is happening to them. They're not doing this to me. That they are using what has been adaptive for them up to this point to get their needs for safety, for connection met. That safety and connection absolutely must happen, as we just heard Sydney kind of talk us through, absolutely must happen before we can move someone into problem solving, before we can move them into reasoning, before they can build new skills to get into that place for effective learning to happen. So when we find that maybe we have clients who are not progressing in their goals, that they're not making the progress in services that we would like to see, to really take a step back and make sure that those needs for safety and connection are being met consistently with that individual so that we can help them get into their front seat on a more consistent basis to be able to make that progress that they would like to see. And then finally, again, keeping in mind that it starts with us. If we want individuals who are well regulated, have the skills to manage their behaviors appropriately, to develop those adaptive skills for resilience, we ourselves have to have those skills. We have to be aware of our own presence in the spaces. We have to be aware of our own capacity, and know how it is that we are showing up and how much we have to give in those spaces, and really recognizing again our own common humanity, that it's hard for us sometimes too, and that's okay. But we use this tool as a way to even gauge, you know, is this the appropriate situation for me to be offering support? Do I have it in this moment to give? And what do I need to do to better support myself in being regulated? So I hope that you all found some value in what it is that we had to offer today. Like I said, This was like a really quick overview of something that we tend to spend a lot of time talking with individuals and organizations to understand and apply. So if you're interested in learning more about Trauma Smart and how we do this work, feel free to scan the QR code to contact us. We definitely appreciate if you have specific feedback for us. Again, this feedback survey is not the one that Renee is going to ask you to fill out as a part of this specific webinar. So please do still complete theirs. But if you'd like to give us some specific feedback, we would appreciate it as well. I'll leave that up for a few minutes. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. Come off mute. Leanne and I are going to hang out here for a few minutes, as long as Renee will let us, to kind of transition out. Thank you so much for being a part of our conversation today. I so appreciate everyone who engaged with us in the chat and participated. You all were really rock stars at picking this up. So, kudos to all of you for taking it in so quickly.